PMO is a facilitator, right? As a PM, if you're in the PM role, you know that your role, best role is a facilitator and bring the right people into the room to make those decisions, right? So from a PMO, but in a lot of organizations, what we've also seen is based on, and you'll see a slide that we talked about, who watches the West Wing? Leo McGarry? You know Leo McGarry? The president, David Bartlett's he was his right-hand man in the office, right? Chief of staff. So Leo McGarry was talking to one of his compadres, and he was telling him a story. And I love West Wing because there's some great stories from a corporate perspective in there. And he was saying, well, there's a man stuck in a manhole. Okay, and he's looking up and saying, so the priest goes by and says, "Oh, priest, could you please help me?" The priest writes a prayer and throws it down the hole. I say, okay, well, the priest is not going to help me. And then a doctor walks by and says, "Doctor, could you help me get out of here?" And he writes a prescription and throws it down the hole. And then he keeps asking for help, and all of a sudden a man jumps down the hole right next to him. He says, "What did you do that for?" He says, and now there are two of us stuck in here. He says, "Yeah, the only difference is that I've been here before, and I know how to get us out of here." That's PMO. As the PMO starts to mature and gets improved, the PMO can start to improve its knowledge base and its maturity to then start to use some of that information to make those decisions. It's lessons learned, right? So a PMO can say, we've been operating for the 5 years. They can go to the executive and say, please give us the authority to start to having some early filters before we come to you. And we've done that in a lot of PMOs where we say, now based on the information, we can actually put together a matrix where we can say we can quickly filter out projects that are not even valid to go into the leadership meetings. Because when we met with Greg's team, Greg Steinhaffel in Target, that first meeting took us 3 hours to go through the funnel of all the projects. And Greg looked at me and said, this is not going to work, right? It's not going to work ongoing. So we had to start to think about how do we use PMOs, lessons learned in the past, to be able to continue to mature the PMO. But the role of the PMO is facilitation, and it has to bring in the executives to be able to make those decisions, using the business case numbers and using those numbers to be able to do that. And what we're talking about today is that the PMO can take that role across the organization to bring in all that information, say, here's the bundle of information, executives, let's help make decisions. Versus each SVP showing up with their own little format of their own business case, of their own things, and saying, I need to sign off, right? And it becomes a whack-a-mole because, the executives say, okay, I'm going to approve this today, I'm going to approve that today, and all of a sudden now you're looking at this, you've got 50 projects running, which has no way of filtering, right? So essentially, the challenge is, our problem is that there is a disconnect between the ambition of the C-level office and the doing of the front line, which is your performance. And that's where the disconnect happens, right? So the PMO's sweet spot is really this middle piece, where the PMO can help connect the dots between what the executives have dreamt up to what the teams are going to execute. And the PMO can elevate itself, or yourself in your roles. If you can elevate yourself to do this role in your organization, what you can do is you can help the organizations and go to executives saying, okay, great strategy, fantastic job with the strategy. We need to now work, number one, to cascade that strategy to the organization, number one, so everybody's aware of what are we going to do. But not just simply cascade, but also connect the dots for that person on the front line who's doing the work to say, here is how my work aligns to the organizational strategy. Okay? So PMO can help facilitate that dialogue. And then next, it can start to take those projects and the strategies and break them down into projects and initiatives, execute on those projects and initiatives, depending on the role of the PMO, right? Some PMOs are only reporting PMOs, there are governance PMOs, so they may not execute. So there will be teams that may execute locally within the various divisions within the organization, and that's okay. But then the PMO can report back on that execution. In some organizations, PMO have the responsibility of execution itself. So the PMO can then execute and then do a KPI, report back scorecard, and then feed that back. And this is where the key information comes back. The PMO can help facilitate, or you in your roles can help facilitate that feedback that the organizations lack when they start their planning processes in April or May of the year, when they're looking around saying, okay, how did we do last year, right? One of the banks that we're working on right now is the CIO didn't have seat at the table when the strategy was being developed. He certainly had seat at the table at the executive board meetings. or team meetings. But when the strategy was being developed, the CIO was saying, well, here's the strategy, IT go execute. One of the things we did is help the CIO to start participating on those executive meetings. And here's what we had said to be able to have the CIO help participate. Every single project that you convert from strategy into projects, what happens at the executive level saying, okay, here's my strategy, and here's how I'm going to execute on these projects, and here's what I'm going to do in the project, here's what I think. And a lot of times, IT teams or a lot of times operational teams get that budget saying, okay, well, I've got $5 million to do this, go do. Right? What we did for the CIO is we said, your PMO or your team that executes on the project can give you lessons learned. And when the CIO started participating in those conversations, he was able to say, well, wait a minute. My PMO had said that similar project last year costed us double that amount of money, so I need more funding. He said, well, a similar project in our organization 2 years ago was failed. So I don't know why this project will be successful. Can we talk about how we can do this differently? So that conversation started much earlier than it actually showed, before it showed up in the hands of the teams who are going to be executing. Right? So you have to think about how do you insert yourself and insert your leaders or your directors or your vice presidents in those conversations so that they can participate and provide that early warning signs to the leadership, if you will. Okay. At Target, we actually built the executive PMO or strategic PMO that reported to the president of the company, and we ensured that the senior director of that organization sat in those conversations. Because if you're going to hold accountable to that team to report back and execute on those projects, that person needs to be on that table to be able to have a word and to be able to say, yes, this is going to work and this is not going to work, if you will. Okay. So within the 5 boxes that we showed, and we're going to double click on all those 5 boxes here in a couple of minutes, but essentially PMO's role can pivot into a different way for each of those boxes. For formulation, PMO can be there to provide consultation and support if needed. A lot of organizations will form strategies without the PMO being there. That's okay. But when you start to convert those projects the strategies into projects, it's important that the PMO is there. So if you're there as a consultative role or supportive role, great. If not, the next piece is where you start to do alignment and activation. The PMO needs to essentially lead or support. And then systems and measures, execution, of course, the PMO needs to lead, or another PMO needs to lead, whomever does the leading, and the PMO can report back, and then providing the feedback and performance. And we'll go through each of these boxes in a minute. So essentially, the core of this is, and this is from the PMI study, where PMI talked about the PMOs or individuals or PMOs. So in your case, if you're thinking about yourself, because most of you guys are not part of the PMO, how do you elevate your role in your organization to be able to execute on strategic stuff? And what PMI said is that PMOs who were leading strategic projects were successful 4 times over than PMOs that weren't, essentially. And some of the traits that those PMOs had were that those PMOs were involved in strategy formulation. So this is the result of a survey that PMI did in 2013, just after the Economist survey came out, and they analyzed 533 large organizations for these numbers. And the report is available on PMI site. You can just do a Google on role of PMO in strategy, and you will see the PMIs. It's called the monthly pulse. PMI comes out with something called a monthly pulse, and one of the monthly pulses had this information in October 2013, I believe. The PMO reports to the senior leadership in the organization, so they get that support and buy-in. It is perceived as helping the organization achieve success. Okay? It has the right resources and then the right number of resources. Right resources meaning the right people on the seats to be able to execute, but the right number of resources to be able to staff, to be able to serve. And then it leads or participates in change management. How many of you actually have change management as a component within your organization? Is there a division or a team that does change management? Great. When it comes to change management, you've got really 2 types of changes. One is change within a project. Right? You're running a project and you have a change in scope, you have a change in timelines, you have a change in budget. You need to go through certain levels of approval to make sure that those changes are approved and inserted back into the project. Right? The second component is organizational change. Is that what you talked about earlier and briefly what you discussed? Is that how does the work that you are putting in practice or the deliverable of your project, so the services and the products that this project is going to deliver, how those things impact the organization as a whole and the individuals within the organization. So let's take an example for say. You're doing a major implementation of SAP. A lot of organizations do implementation of the large enterprise. It's an ERP. Everybody has a lot of smiles on face, you know, because none of the SAP implementations have gone well. Cut the recording. But it's a challenging project, right? It's a large implementation. It's tough because the biggest component of such an implementation is change, because you are changing the way people do their jobs. You are changing the way people interact with the systems. And what the change management role would do is having an earlier assessment and earlier involvement of the change management team to start identifying who are the users of this process or this service or this product, and how does this affect or impact them positively or negatively. And once you start to identify those, then that team can actually start to have an early conversation and understanding with those teams. I'll give you an example. We managed a fairly large initiative for a retail organization where they were impacting all their locations across Canada. So this would change their back office systems, this would change their front office systems, it would drastically change their technology within their stores. So what we did is, in the early days of this, we started to engage the people on the ground. So we had, so this is a restaurateur in Canada, we actually had the restaurant managers, some key restaurant managers across the country, and some the actual people who are on the front lines who take orders, they staff the back rooms on our project. And some of them who are local to the team, so the team was based out of Toronto, we would actually ask them to drive in for project conversations. Others we would video conference in. But the conversations we would lead with them saying, here's what we're implementing in your stores. How does this impact you? How does it impact your staff? How does it impact your day-to-day? To get a better understanding of that. Because if done right, you can increase the adoption and implementation and success of your project. Because remember that 20% of the organizations who said that, you know, even after the project was done, it still didn't give me the value of the project? Well, one of the big reasons is because of change management and the lack of adoption. Right? So at Execute Strategy, one of the things we do is actually we've put together something called an adoption barometer. So very early in the project, you can actually go through a bunch of questions and it'll come back with, here's your adoption barometer at this stage of the project, and then you can do a test throughout the project in terms of how this project will come across when you're actually going into adoption. Right? So a huge role the PMO can play. Now, a lot of organizations do it very differently. RBC, for example, has an executive PMO, and they have change management office at the executive level, but they both partner together. Okay? Some of the other organizations I've seen, the change management office sits within the HR role, versus the PMO sits within the executive office, or if it's an IT, PMO sits within IT. But then they partner together, like you had said, so, you know, or like you had said earlier in terms of Honeywell, because they come in as a consultative approach to kind of take a look at what this project is all about and how is it going to impact the stakeholders and the users and provide you that consultation. And in your case, they actually actively work to make sure these changes are not impacting or impacting this properly, if you will. Right? So it's a key component of that, if you will. If you guys don't have change management within your organizations, again, thinking about your growth, your career growth as well, think about that. Change management is actually a huge career opportunity for a lot of people. It has taken off recently, right? And there's a lot of different organizations who do certification. PROSI is a huge change management certification. It's an internationally recognized certification program. And if you guys are interested in change management, if you have that people side of things, then you're interested in how your work impacts, you know, people and others, and you're interested in thinking about change management as a career opportunity, I think it'd be fantastic for you to think about that. Okay. So One of the things we have developed because as executive strategy, we help a lot of PMOs who are thinking about their maturity, or our troubled PMOs who are thinking about how do we continue to add value to the organization. One of the things we've developed is essentially a competency triangle for those PMOs. We come in and assess the PMO, and it's based on OPM3, which I think is going to be sunsetting soon. PMI has a model called OPM3, which is Organizational Project Maturity Model. If you go to PMI site, you can search it. So we've built this triangle based on those facets. Essentially, we assess the PMO on 3 areas. One is the practice. How do you practice the work of the PMO, the business of the PMO? Second is the processes that you have in place. And third is your people. So you're really your 3 Ps. We do a full assessment, and then based on that, we also have an industry-leading indicator that we will compare you to based on your industry or your organization, and then we will do a delta. So let's say if your organization is the outside triangle, after the assessment, we actually compare you with the inside triangle, and then the delta between those becomes your roadmap that you can put in place for your PMO to evolve, for your project managers to evolve. Even though you don't have a PMO, but you have project managers in your organization, you can use that with your project managers, you can use that with your project management practice to understand where we are today and where we're trying to go, and how can we put together a roadmap so that our PMO, our project management practice, can be successful, if you will. So we talked about the what, the problem we're trying to solve, and we talked about a couple of hows. But essentially, if you start to double-click on each of those boxes that we talked about, the 5 boxes, after the strategy is developed, the first box is alignment. The first thing the PMO can help facilitate, strategy is built, fantastic, thank you, executive team. The first thing the PMO can help is to take those strategies and start to break them into initiatives, right? And have a very concentrated, conscious conversation with the executives around how are we going to execute on the strategy, how we're going to achieve it, through what projects. And that's where the prioritization comes in, and that's when, based on your organization, you would do either a business case, you would do initiative capture form with the back of a cocktail napkin business case, but you got to find a process and a way for you to be able to come to consensus. So here are the initiatives that we're going to manage, and here's how these initiatives will roll back up and allow us to achieve those strategies, if you will. Okay? Once those strategies are converted into initiatives, they then need to be communicated to the organization. Because 9 times out of 10, what we've seen is that the organization, the people in the team, or your people on the front line would get informed of, here's the vision of the organization, and here's what our strategies are. But they don't get informed about what the projects are, because projects will come to them one at a time throughout the course of the year, which is fine. The organization should have the flexibility to adjust to the economic condition, to adjust to competition, and to adjust to how your strategies are doing. And that's always the case, because we're in a world where things do change. But initially, when you have formed the strategies, you do need to start to come up with those projects that need to kick off. So once the projects have been established, they need to be communicated to the teams, because that's where the teams are saying, oh, that is how my work aligns to the organizational strategy, because I'm going to be participant in that project, or I'll be leading that project. Because most people in the organization associate themselves with either project work or operational work. So once the projects are defined, they can say, oh, I'm participating in that project. That means if I achieve the objectives of that project, then I will be able to help the organizational achieve their strategy, if you will. Now, PMO doesn't necessarily do that all the time in organizations. A lot of organizations have communication teams. Organizations have change management teams who can actually help facilitate that communication to trickle down that message, which we call it the strategy cascade, where you're saying, okay, well, here's the strategy, but here's how it matters to you. Here's how it aligns to your goals and objectives. And then next, the PMO can actually facilitate or work with HR to say, HR, how are you going to measure these people? Because they're going to do all this work, right? So their yearly objectives, their yearly performance reviews and stuff. How do you measure them? How do you incent them, the carrot and the stick thing? How do you incent them so that they're working on those objectives so that you can measure them and then roll that back as well? Because 9 times out of 10, if you ask an individual how is their individual goals and objectives align to the organizational strategy, and they'll tell you that it doesn't, because it doesn't line up. So HR can then do a phenomenal job if you provide this view to HR to say, okay, we've got 1,000 people in the organization, they're all working on these projects. It's easy to go out and say, as part of your objectives, I want you to put these projects in your objectives for the year. And when they have it in there, they know that they're aligned to the organizational strategy. Okay? Some of these things are simpler said than done, but again, in your roles, if you are part of the PMO, or if you're not part of the PMO, you got to think about how do you start to facilitate those conversations. Okay? Then, once the projects have been defined, on the onset, you need to define how you're going to measure those projects. One of the things we usually do when we're delivering or managing large projects is ask the question of what is success? Define success. And a lot of times people will say, well, here's success to me and stuff. Well, what we usually do, we'll go to the sponsor, and you guys can do this as a fairly easy thing to say. You go to the sponsor and saying, I want you to tell me, let's assume the project is done in February of 2016. I want you to tell me, if you and I are sitting in this room on February 28th, 2016, how do you want to feel, and what do you want to have achieved? What do you want to have achieved? That becomes success. That becomes your success, the measuring stick that your team will be measured on, because that's what the sponsor is thinking about. Right? So it's important to define those successes, there's those KPIs, those measures early on, and then again communicate that back to the team, because then the team will know what are they measured on. And you will know what those measures are for those projects. Because a lot of times people start projects, teams start projects, and PMs will start projects where they don't define the success measures. And they may have successes defined, but they may not have KPIs defined. They may not have measures defined. Right? And once you have that defined, you also have to, on an ongoing basis, define how are you going to track it and how often are you going to report it out. Okay? I was having a conversation with the executive, was the president of a medium-sized company, and we're talking about his PMO or his project managers leading a bunch of projects and stuff like that, and we talked about different examples of what we've done in the past and different companies that we've worked with and stuff like that. And it was a really interesting concept that he used, and I asked him, is it okay for me to share with others? And he said, as an executive, as an industry leader, and as a guy who's running this organization, I want help with focusing on the big rocks. Right? And this picture kind of gives how many of you guys have gone with your kids doing mineral searching, collecting the stones when you go to one of these farms and stuff, where you start to sift through the stones and find the jewels within the stones, right? So that's really resonates with me, because what you're focusing on is focusing on your jewels, on your big rocks, things that really matter, right? So when it comes to the role of the PMO as a strategy execution organization, a PMO can be a lot of things, and you can execute on every single project. You can be doing a lot of things. Even as you as an individual, as a PM, you can be executing on a lot of things. What you need to take a step back and saying, what are the biggest things that are going to really matter? Focus on those things, because a lot of times PMOs, teams, project managers, people struggle with that. And what you need to be able to say, what are the things that really matter to me as part of my career growth, but at the same time, what does matter to me that is going to help me impact the organization the most? Now, this doesn't essentially tie into necessarily on the PMO's role execution. This is something that I do on a daily basis when I essentially define my work list or my task list or my priorities, right? So one of the things I do every morning is I'll list out all my tasks, everything that I need to get done, and then I'll draw a line. And I'll draw a line on everything that matters goes on the top, and everything goes below the line. So it's above the line, below the line. And to me, I need to get those things done first, because those are the things that really matter. Right? Has anybody heard the analogy of eat the frog? So there's an analogy of successful people eat the frog, because eat the frog is like an ugly term, right? Eat the frog is very, it's hard to do and it's ugly and it's yucky. Well, what they say is that if successful people do the hardest, ugliest, toughest thing first thing in the morning, because it's done and over with, and that's where your focuses are, right? So when it comes to execution, as a PMO, as a PM, think about not executing on everything, doing everything. Focus on executing the projects that matter the most. Because once you've done the dissemination from the strategy to initiatives, and now you've got, let's say, 100 initiatives. Now, if your PMO executes on projects and it delivers on the projects, you have to be very cognizant of the fact that, well, I can't execute on 100 projects, right? So you have to think about what are the big projects that matter to you most, and that's the one you're going to execute on, because they are your big rocks. But then at the same time, enable others to be successful. So one of the things we implemented at one of the retailers is we implemented a framework for people who are not really project managers, but they were executing on some of the key projects. We implemented the framework, so it was a very simple 10-step process in terms of how do they start a project to how do they end the project and how do they report on it. Because what that did, it gave them a little bit of a roadmap to execute their own projects, but it was also kind of selfish because we were reporting on all the projects. And because they ensured they followed that framework, it made it easy for us to report on that, because it was consistency saying, so if I said, what's your initiation phase? Everybody knew what the initiation phase was. What's your definition of green? Everybody had the same definition of green. Everybody had the same definition of red. Everybody had the same definition of yellow, okay? And this is essentially something that we have put in place in a lot of organizations at the executive level, something called a monthly pulse. It's a 1-hour all-hands meeting where essentially you walk in, you send these materials to the executive team, and essentially ask some very tough questions. Number one, are we doing the right things? Are we doing the right things? Because there are a lot of projects, we want to make sure that we're doing the right things. If there's a project in trouble, we ask a question around, what would it take for us to continue to be successful on this project? Okay. If there's another important initiative that we would rather be working on, what would that be? One of the things I always see is when these kind of conversations happen, executives kind of get into different rat holes, and organizations, the conversation goes everywhere. And I always ask a tough question around, what is the most important thing we should be talking about right now? What is the most important thing we should be talking about right now that essentially brings everybody back on topic and you back on having a conversation about the projects and your pulse conversation. Okay. And then essentially from the PMO's role, there's a continual feedback. So this is what we talked about earlier, where at the end of the year, but don't wait till the end of the year, but at the end of every month or every quarter, you need to be able to put your hand up and say, as a PMO, here's our lessons learned, here's our feedback to the teams who are building strategies. Say, guys, for last year, here's how things are going. So as you're thinking about developing your strategy for next year, we want you to ensure that you feed this back in and feed this forward. Feed back versus feed forward, right? So it's important that you feed this forward to your thinking for next year, right? People talk about feedback all the time. Well, feedback is good, but it's always looking in the rearview mirror and what has already happened. But feedback, if done properly, can be used better if you use it as feed forward to improve what's coming up. Okay? So then, in that sense, the role of the PMO can be pivoted as the role of strategy execution by following some of these 5 buckets. So, when it comes to formulation, PMO can be in consultative and support role. When it comes to alignment, it could be a support and lead role. And in terms of putting measures in place, it could be a support and lead role based on the PMO's role. Execution, of course, if PMO is leading execution, the PMO should lead. If not, facilitate or help other PMOs be successful or others be successful. And finally, provide that feedback and report out in terms of how the projects are going, if you will. Okay? And we can probably take some questions.
Do you find that for the monthly pulse, there's different levels at which you could be doing that? And what would be, obviously we know what the highest level is, what would be the most, I guess, not the lowest level, but you know what I'm trying to say?
Yep.
Where it's still
Great question. So it depends on the role of the PM or the PMO. So if the PMO is project management office, then you're doing it at a project level. If the PMO is a program management office, you're doing it at a program level. And if it's a portfolio management office, you're doing it at a portfolio level, right? So it depends. Then in terms of the individual involvement, it also depends on how the organization is structured, right? So you could start off at maybe a senior manager, director level that you could do the sponsor level or the VP level. And then perhaps you could go to the next level, if you will, from an executive perspective. What has helped us in the past, especially if you're focusing on the executives, is what we tend to do is that we try to replicate this within each of the SVPs. In most organizations that we've worked with, each SVPs and VPs want to make sure that they're prepared before they go in front of the executive. So what we would do is that we would actually send a customized deck to that team. Because here's what we've collected from your teams, here's how the projects are going, here's the report out on your projects, and we will send out to that SVP, and then the SVP will then use that in their own status meetings with their staff to do a similar pulse, to be prepared to be able to answer those questions in terms of the executive. Exactly. I recommend not doing it on a Monday or a Friday, just right, because by the time you walk out, people come back on a Monday, they've forgotten half the things, and the follow-ups aren't there. Mondays are harder because everybody's just coming in, so usually what we tend to do is we focus on strategic conversations, either on a Tuesday to a Thursday, right in the middle of the week, right? Because that allows people time. So if there's pre-reads that have been sent out, people have time to kind of prep on a Monday if we're meeting on a Tuesday. Friday is just, it's just harder in most organizations, especially being in Canada, we've got a lot of long weekends and stuff, it just becomes challenging, especially on a Monday too, right? So you had a question back there.
How do you create a project team where one player could be really strong tactically to build something, to create something? Another might be not quite as strong or knowledgeable, but is more strategically important. I'm coping with this in my own consulting business. It's hard to figure out where you go with the tactical player or the person who strategically will take you down the road maybe later on.
So some good questions. I think what you need to do is essentially define what really matters when you're hiring people, right? Is it important for you that they have a lot of experience in the industry versus is it important if they have a passion? Once they have the can-do attitude, you kind of start to get a lot of mix of different things where you have somebody who's really passionate, who's maybe a junior guy, want to aspire to become a senior person, but doesn't have as much experience, right? So I think it's a harder question to answer fairly simply, but there are a lot of facets that kind of go into it. You also need to think about who your client is, who you're hiring for, the culture fit, and so on and so forth, and who would you like to work with? So I always ask the questions like, can I sit, anytime I hire someone, can I sit down with this person and have a beer, and just talk about life? And is this person that kind of down-to-earth personality? Even if I'm trying to have doing business with someone, like if I can have that conversation with someone, I think it's probably a good enough person to be able to have that conversation.
Any tips on a lot of what I'm doing from a project management perspective is merger and acquisition. So our company grows by acquisition. It's very cross-functional. And trying to bring the group that I'm responsible for, so it's a constant change management as well as trying to manage the work.
Yeah. So we just finished work with a retail organization that bought another small retail, and they're trying to merge the organizations and stuff. And so we had put a PM in there to kind of help facilitate that. So there are a couple of facets, right? So number one, if the other organization has a disciplined project management discipline, so you're trying to merge the PM discipline itself and the PMO. But second thing is that the actual act of doing the merger itself, right? So I think the couple of things in there, I think the change management is key, but your role as HR, working with HR is key as well, because a lot of times what we feel is that a lot of organizations don't have the discipline within HR to do the project management piece of it.
So what happens, I work for OpenText,
Okay.
so a large software company
Yep.
in Canada. So I'm responsible for orders to cash, opportunity to cash.
Yep.
And, at times we do struggle with, strategy is done by the,
Yep.
FLT or ELT,
Mm-hmm.
and then we've got to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's not just easy steps to do that. I think what you have to take a look at is the big thing is from a change management perspective, when you're acquiring an organization or merging within it, you want to do a discovery phase where it feels like it's an unthreatened environment, where you start to do a discovery between your team and their team and see where the fits are, right? And I think then from that perspective, you start to put a plan in place which is mutual, right? Because a lot of times when we do an M&A, it's kind of saying, you come in, we pull you in, and we do it our way, versus it's more mutual saying, how do we do this together from that perspective? And if you like, we can talk about my experience, what we've just recently done as well. I can kind of give you some pointers there as well, but I think I'll need a little bit more context there. So no problem. Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you.